Today we begin a journey you're already on. A journey hard to avoid because of the sheer abundance of the medium we're going to be taking on within this course. The medium of film. An art form with which almost all of us are already intimately familiar. Because we've grown up watching films. Those films from the indie to the blockbuster that have served as the primary source most of us has when it comes to looking for fulfillment or escapism or education and edification through art. But what makes the experience you're about to take on quite different is the fact that from today onward, and within all 32 lessons to come, we will seek to view this thing from the other side, from behind the scenes as it were, as we excavate through the history of this art form to truly understand just what its place is, why it's so prolific, and why writings within this medium are some of the most beloved and culturally integrated artworks of the modern age. And so, with that being said, let's get started. Let's press play. And so, with all that said, welcome to your first lesson of your professional diploma in screenwriting. Lesson 1, the key elements of story. And now, let's begin by framing our lesson objectives. Our first lesson objective is to identify and implement the key aspects of story, really figuring out what those foundational building blocks of story are. Our second key objective is to describe the importance of the hero's journey, a story structure which you'll come to see is absolutely profuse and finds itself in every art form, but especially within film. Our last key objective for this lesson is to explain which tools of the trade are necessary to succeed as a screenwriter. Those things you need to have in your tool belt, as it were, when you're looking to go into the world and make your case as a professional. And so, now that we have all that in place, let's get to it. And let's begin with a question. What is a writer's place in the world? Well, a writer is someone who seeks to shape the world we live in through the art they create by virtue of what they put out into the world. A writer is also someone who seeks to observe, discuss, and record cultural perspectives, who looks at the world and notes the things that they find interesting, takes those things to discussion tables to really understand which dialectics are at work, and then records those cultural perspectives that they think are deserving of preservation for posterity. But lastly, a writer is uniquely someone who seeks to unify through art, this unification mechanism that's always the final end of the writing process is something that I hope you will come to see the value of as we progress throughout this course. And so, with that said, let's dive straight into our first core topic of the lesson, the core of story. Now, let's have a look at what the essential building blocks of fiction are, because remember, yes, we're studying writing for the screen, but this does, of course, fall under the larger umbrella of fiction. The first core building block is one you may not expect, and that is research. Because before embarking upon the writing of your screenplay, research will be infinitely important. The second is setting, where your work takes place, where your characters live and where your story plays off. The third is those characters, who they are as people, truly coming to a place where they feel real to you, and so feel real to your audience member. And the fourth is dialogue, which of course enjoys an incredible amount of importance when we're speaking within the medium of film. And so with those building blocks now known, let's move on to a deeper examination of the first building block we just covered. And that is research. So, what is research? Well, it is the first step in building your world, your story world. And it is that first step you have to take in moving toward a state in which your work can be perceived as both accurate and believable in every sense possible. So believable in terms of its setting, believable in terms of its characters, and believable in terms of dialogue in the way your characters address each other. And so, what are some key questions we can ask here to make sure that we stay on the correct path when it comes to doing proper research? Well, our first key question is, where do my characters live? Because remember, the region in which people live affects so much about how they see the world, so it's important to ask that question and understand what that question means. Second question is, when do my characters live? Because the time within which people live, of course, affects how they look at the world. There's so many things that come into play when we're looking at locking characters into a specific time period. Our third question is, what is the regional history? Because if we're looking at where do my characters live, you could say, yes, my character lives in Austria, for example, but is it particularly rural? Is it more urban? These things matter, and those things, when we have those definitions, come with their own precise historical factors, and those factors are often bound by geography, by the region in which they live specifically, so it's important to get more specific when we're doing research. And our last question, how does living there affect norms and general human behaviors, really does tie the other three together. So, now that we've covered those key questions, let's look at a quick case study story idea to really try to quickly understand just how the answers to those key questions will come to present themselves as something cohesive. Our case study story idea is, I want to write a story about the American Civil Rights Movement. So, first you'll start by asking, where? Where did this all happen? When did this all happen becomes incredibly important in this case, as we know. What was it that happened? And how did it happen? So, your answer, your very summarized answer, it must say, and a very entry-level answer to this question may end up looking something like this. They live in the American South. It's 1960 at the height of Jim Crow, and in a region historically divided along racial lines. This has led to frustration and anger in the Black community, and from this, the Civil Rights Movement was born. Now, once again, this is an incredibly simplified version of this answer, and of course, in your research phase, you will be asking more intelligent questions and come to a much more long-form answer. But you can see that already here, historical context has been created, and that's how you're always going to have to be looking at things. But as for the more complex way of looking at research, do look forward to lesson 2 of this module, where we'll be looking at research in depth. But now we come to a key question, a question you may already be sitting with. What if your story is set somewhere fictitious, i.e. there's nowhere in the real world to really look to garner accurate answers? Well, what you do in this case is you ask the same questions, but you invent the answers. The important thing here is that you have answers to these questions. It needn't be absolutely real-world accurate, and that's not going to happen if you're working within a genre like sci-fi or fantasy. But it's important that you, as a writer, have the information in your head so that there is a basic logic of your world that is abided by. But that being said, we will be getting to those more complex concepts further on in this course. So for now, let's move on and look at our second building block of fiction, and that is setting. Now, what is setting? Well, simply put, it's the time and place of a story. And this is the portion that is most informed by research, as you may have noticed from those key questions we just asked. This, however, is where you get more specific about the when and where, the time and place. Key questions to ask in terms of your setting are the following. What were the significant cultural events of that setting? Of course, what happened that shaped the way the people in that space look at the world? Secondly, we have to ask then, what are the regional norms? Of course, as influenced by these significant cultural events, but the general belief systems that find their place within that society that affect the way people move through the world. We have to ask those questions because you need to know what the status quo of your setting is. And then another question that is often overlooked by the young writer is, what's the natural environment like? Because you really just do want to know what the general weather patterns are like, how people move through the world. That affects so much in terms of hours when people are awake and asleep, for example, or the kinds of clothing people are liable to have. These are questions that you have to know the answers to as a screenwriter so that you can imbue your screenplay with a lot of things that feel real, feel accurate for the space in which your characters are moving, because there is nothing more alienating than things simply not making sense in terms of its setting. And it is all this absolute focus when it comes to setting and research that creates the immersive experience for your viewer, because that is what they're looking to do. They're looking to watch a film or a TV show for that matter, and they want to be able to lose themselves in it. They want to be able to suspend their disbelief. But that being said, we will be getting to this immersive experience and the idea of the suspension of disbelief further on in this course as well. So do look forward to that. This lesson is very much an introduction to all the core concepts, but trust that they will be accurately and extensively unpacked within the 32 lessons we have to do that. So for now, we can move on and look at our third key building block of story. And that building block is my favorite and arguably the most interesting one: character. So what are characters? Well, obviously, they are the people in your story. They are, however, the anthropomorphized representations of your themes. Now, the word anthropomorphized there might be quite big, but essentially what anthropomorphized means that they are the people used to represent abstract concepts, those concepts that make up the themes of your film. And see, characters are therefore the aspect upon which your story relies most. Think about films you love. Think about how much you remember the characters, how much you empathized with them, how much you remember how they felt within specific intense moments of those films, or perhaps even joyous and not particularly hard moments of those films. We remember characters distinctly. They are the thing we walk away with, and therefore they are the thing that I want you as writers to concentrate on the most, because humans, as the great theatre practitioner Peter Brook said, are always going to be the most interesting thing in the room. And so, when it comes to characters, what are some key questions to answer? Well, firstly, how old is your character? Because of course, their age affects how they look at the world, how naive they may be, or how wizened they may be, in terms of the world around them, and in terms of themselves, how self-aware they are. Secondly, what is their gender? Because remember that unfortunately the case is true that we live in an incredibly heteropatriarchal society. That means that women and men are distinctly different in terms of the way in which they're treated by society, not in terms of their capabilities. And so this is an incredibly important point of inquiry to engage with when you're designing a character. Thirdly, what is their family like? Because when we look at the Western world at large, at least, we have the idea of the nuclear family. We vest a lot of cultural expectation within that system, and so when there's any kind of deviance, it can create sustained psychological dynamics within people. So it's important to ask those important questions about what their early childhoods were like, what their experience of growing up in their world was like, as filtered through the lens of their nuclear family dynamic, or whether they existed independently of the nuclear family dynamic and how that impacted the way in which they look at the world and move through it. Now, the last question here is simply where are they from? And this very much ties into setting, and so I won't go over it too much now, but suffice it to say that character work will be an incredibly important point of focus within this course, and so do look forward to our lessons on character further in this module, our two-part lesson in lessons 4 and 5. But before we move on, I'd like to talk about character archetypes. These are also known as stock characters. And while they're often disregarded as something lazy, there are actually helpful frameworks to make sure that all the themes seeking expression can be well executed by the writer, deciding that a character is going to represent something for you and then playing them off against other characters. And when we're talking about character archetypes, what are some of the primary ones we deal with? Now, these are ones that you may not even realize you're already intimately familiar, but we, for the most part, grew up on film, and so you will recognize these characters in their descriptions and have 1,000 examples of them stored in your head already. And the three primary ones I'd like to cover in this lesson before we move on to our last building block are 1. The protagonist, 2. The antagonist, and 3. The romance character. Let's get to our protagonist. Well, our protagonist is also known as the good guy or the hero, and there are again 1,000 examples of this we can think of. They are the center of the story. And they are the point of view that matters most. Then we have our antagonist. This is the bad guy or the villain. He or she obviously contrasts the protagonist. And they must be defeated for the protagonist to succeed. Now, an important point to cover here before we go on is that while your hero is most often a person, your antagonist needn't be. Your antagonist could be something completely abstract. It could be the status quo. It could be an organization. It could be a general mode of culture. But usually what we're looking to do is really have a human hero so that your audience can identify and empathize with that person, and so be able to really immerse themselves in the film that you're hoping to create. But now let's move on and talk about our third character archetype, and that is the romance character, who's often known as the love interest. Now, unfortunately, it is the case with a lot of classical film and literature, it has to be said, that the romance character is almost completely dependent on the desires of the protagonist. And they serve as the protagonist's inspiration and potential aid throughout the narrative. And also, unfortunately, it has to be said, functions often as their reward. And I've said unfortunately multiple times here because it is true that romance characters are typically female. And that is something that we're going to be talking about once again at length within this course, looking at really writing female characters in a progressive way rather than in a reductive way, in an objectifying way, in an objectifying way. We're going to be looking at how we, as writers of any gender, can write female characters that are worth seeing and worth putting out into the world because they move the world forward. But now it is that we come to our fourth building block, dialogue. And let's have a quick look at what dialogue is. Well, simply, dialogue is the person-to-person speech in your screenplay. We get that from that Latin prefixture there, die meaning to. And this is the primary literary component of a film. Those are the words you want to appear most on the page, and they are also the only words that your audience is going to hear. And some key questions when it comes to dialogue are, where are they from? Because as we know, regionalisms and slang are a big part of the way people speak. Secondly, how old are they? Because of course, your age is going to affect the grip on language you have no matter where you are. Thirdly, we have to ask, how close are they? Meaning, how close are the characters who are speaking? Because, of course, there are different modes of speech. Some relationships require and create the opportunity for informal speech, whereas some are incredibly formal. So we have to ask these questions about human intimacy when it comes to writing dialogue. And then, lastly, what are they feeling? A pretty obvious question, but remember that dialogue changes. The way people speak changes based on what they're feeling. But once again, this is very much a broad overview of dialogue, and we will be enjoying a full lesson on dialogue within this module, so do look forward to that. And for now, let's move on to our second core topic. And that core topic is the hero's journey. Let's begin by defining our term here. Question: what is the most popular story structure in all of film? Well, the answer is simple. Regarding characters, it is the hero's journey. So, the hero's journey is a story structure that applies to usually your main character, that is your protagonist or your hero, hence the name. And when we're looking at what this story structure is, we have to look at where it came from. Well, it was first officially coined by the academic writer Joseph Campbell in 1949. But the thing with this story structure is the fact that it was apparent for at least a millennium before. See, this story structure really does find its provenance in ancient Greek theatre. And when we're looking at the hero's journey, these are, as you can see on the left, your basic plot points. But we won't be going into it too deeply right now because we will be covering it extensively when we look at story structures in a much more in-depth way. So for now, just know that the hero's journey is a story structure that pertains to character primarily, and that it tracks the movement of a character from the beginning to an end of a narrative in a cyclic fashion, once again, as you can see represented graphically on the left. And this, as you can see on the right, is how the integration of your story elements works, because see, the structure, either the hero's journey or, as you'll come to learn, the 3-act structure, is the framework of your house, as it were. Your basic building blocks, your story elements, are the things you put inside the rooms to make them interesting. But the structure of everything are the walls, the beams of your house. And it's these things working together that create the immersive experience, so that your viewer can walk through the front door of this house, as it were, and experience it in the way that you intend them to. So, with that covered, let's move on and talk briefly about genre. Now, what is a genre? Well, simply put, it is a style or category of an art form. And it provides a set of constraints which must be abided to preserve the sanctity of a genre. Essentially what that means, in very simple terms, is that a genre is just a set of guidelines so that your audience can mediate their expectations when they're entering the cinema. Because if you want to watch a horror, you know that you can expect certain things, and so your audience member needs to be able to trust the genre classification of your work. And that is essentially what genre is. It's a way to mediate audience expectations and to create a kind of subcultural history of film, as it were. But we will be getting to genre once again in a lot more detail, but this time in Module 2, where we'll be looking deeply into the primary genres of the modern age of film. And we'll be doing so because genre exists within all media, yes, but it is especially pertinent within film. On the one hand, because film is the most profuse media that we deal with, and on the other hand, because with film, because there is just so much of it, it becomes almost more important to have these genre lines drawn so that we can more accurately choose for ourselves as writers and viewers those sets of story constraints that work best for our personal inclinations and desires. Now, let's look at some common examples of genre, ones with which you will already be familiar. Firstly, there's comedy, and it's designed broadly to make you laugh. Then there's drama, which again broadly is designed to make you cry. Then there's horror, which of course scares you. And then there's science fiction or sci-fi that provides either escape or commentary by metaphor. But we will be getting into all these deeper mechanics, as I said, in Module 2. So for now, we can move on and ask the following key question. How does the hero's journey change across different genres? The answer is simple. It doesn't. It's the story elements that change, because remember, your story structures are the walls of the house. The story elements, those things we put in the rooms, are the things governed by genre, broadly speaking. Because of course, nothing within the world of writing is absolute. There is always space for debate. So all I can do with a course like this is give you my point of view and trust that you can gain something usable from it as you embark upon the formation of your own artistic point of view. But now, let's get to our third core topic of the lesson, and that core topic is the tools of the trade. Let's begin this section with a question. What are the tools used by professional screenwriters, writers who seek to make screenwriting their main source of income, their main career? The professional toolkit simply includes the following. Software. The editing process, which is incredibly vital. And the idea of the ancillary documentation you have to know how to set up if you want to be a screenwriter who engages with it professionally. So let's begin with software. Now, writing software. It is an integral part of the screenwriting process in a way that it isn't for other kinds of writing. But it is necessary because screenwriting operates within a standard format. And the most popular software options that you could seek to use are Scrivener and Final Draft. Now, The question then here has to be asked, why is the standardization of format important? Well, it's because the screenplay, unlike with other kinds of writing, is only step one of the filmmaking process. It needs to be navigated by a creative team later who need to speak the same language and need to completely understand what the writer was on about and trying to achieve. And adapted versions will be created during the production process based on the department of the filmmaking mechanism working with the script. Also, what's interesting is that much is inferred based on the script. For example, did you know that 1 page of your script should equal 1 minute of screen time? These are the kinds of things that this format standardization is trying to achieve by virtue of really being insistent that your screenplay looks a certain way, but that won't compromise the art as you will come to learn and definitely learn on the ground as you start using the software. It is about learning the format first, yes, but then about injecting your own artistic prowess into it, which is perfectly possible. There is enough wiggle room to work within, so please don't feel too confined by the idea that you don't have absolute free reign in terms of how it looks on the page. All of the content, when it comes down to it, is still up to you. And for your information, throughout this course, we will be using Final Draft for all our demos, which will come in later modules. And we'll be using Final Draft because yes, Scrivener is an option, but Final Draft is the Hollywood standard. It is the global standard. It is the software with which most Best Picture winners for the last few years have been written and will continue to be written. It's an incredibly useful piece of software that I highly suggest you invest in or start a free trial of just so you can get a handle on how it works and the ease with which it works. But it really does take some doing. So there is going to be a period of adjustment, but trust me, it will be worth it. But now let's move on to the second tool of the trade. Editing. What is editing? Well, simply, it is the process of revising your script. Therefore, editing is often called revision or the revisions of your script. And it is where necessary changes are made to A, firstly, and most importantly, create the best story possible, but B, support eventual production for screen. And during the editing process, it is incredibly important to be self-critical. And why is this mode of self-criticism important? Well, it's because future drafts will happen where other opinions will matter. And so, you must be able to, as writer, stand by the final product before the director or producers or anyone else gets involved with it. And so some key questions to ask during the editing process are: is this content necessary? Can it be removed and will the sanctity of the story still be preserved? 2. Does it make sense? A very simple question, but one very well worth asking. And thirdly, did I achieve what I set out to do? Because that is the first question that you have to be able to answer yes to before you let your baby go and let other people get involved. But again, we will be getting into editing in a much more complex way at different points throughout this course. So this most assuredly doesn't cover all of it, but definitely gives you the base impression you need to understand just how important editing is when it comes to the literary mechanism. And so we can now move on and look at the idea of ancillary documentation. What are these documents? What are these extra helpful documents? Well, they are articles of writing and visual content sometimes that help sell the screenplay to potential producers. So they are extra, but they're all designed to complement your screenplay, which is the main course. And these documents make the process of understanding what the writer hopes to achieve much easier. And they are a short form option for understanding the story without having to read the full script. Scripts tend to run between 90 and 120 pages, so that is a chunk of something to sit through. And these short form options allow your film to make its case more easily without having to present its full self to the reader. Here are some examples of ancillary documentation. Number 1, your synopsis. This simply is a summary of your story. Number 2, a one-pager. This is all the essential information that's necessary to know about your screenplay on one page. And thirdly, there's the pitch deck. Now this combines visual and story elements to make the film come alive on paper. But once again, we will be getting into the deeper technicalities of these documents later in this course. But so it is that we come to the end of this lesson. And look at that, you're already one lesson deep into the 8 lessons that make up this module and the 32 that make up this course as a whole. Well done, and I'll see you soon for lesson 2, our lesson on the deeper complexities of research. Goodbye.